The front door was wide open, but the chain was still latched. At first, I thought it was the angle. I stood at the end of the hallway, halfway between the kitchen and the living room, staring toward the entryway as if distance itself might be distorting what I saw. The porch light outside cast a pale wedge into the house, illuminating the doorframe and a slice of the tiled floor. The door was open, wide enough to admit the night air, but the chain, stretched taut across the gap, remained hooked into place. It didn't make sense. I blinked, once, twice, waiting for the illusion to correct itself. But it didn't. The door remained open, the chain remained latched, and the space between them didn't behave like space. Cold air seeped in through the opening, brushing against my bare arms. It wasn't a breeze, not a current moving from outside to in, but a steady presence, like the temperature on that side of the house had dropped and was pressing inward, patiently. I hadn't opened the door. I knew that immediately, with a certainty that felt almost defensive. I remembered locking it. I remembered sliding the chain across, hearing the soft metallic click as it settled into its slot. That had been hours ago, sometime after dinner, part of a routine so ingrained I could recall it without effort. So how? I took a step forward. The floor creaked beneath me, louder than it should have. The house had been quiet all evening, wrapped in that familiar suburban stillness, the kind that settled in after midnight when even distant traffic faded to a low, intermittent hum. But now the silence felt pressurized, as though the walls were holding something back. Another step. The hallway stretched ahead of me, narrow and dim. The overhead light wasn't on, but the glow from the open door provided just enough illumination to define shapes: the coat rack, the small table with the bowl for keys, the mirror hanging beside it. I didn't remember the mirror being tilted. I slowed. It was subtle, just a few degrees off, but enough that the reflection didn't align the way I expected. The hallway in the mirror seemed longer, the angle slightly wrong. My own silhouette, faint and stretched, didn't match the position of my body. I stopped moving. For a moment, I considered turning on the light. But something about that felt incorrect. Like introducing brightness would expose something I wasn't ready to see. Or worse, something that wasn't ready to be seen. So I kept the lights off. Another step. The cold intensified as I approached the door. It wasn't just temperature now, it had weight, a density that made the air feel thicker, harder to move through. My breath became visible, faint wisps forming and dissolving in front of me. That shouldn't have been possible. It wasn't that cold. Not outside, not inside, not anywhere near here. I reached the small table by the door and rested my hand on its edge, grounding myself. The wood felt normal, solid, real. I looked directly at the door. It was open. There was no denying it now. The edge of the door sat several inches away from the frame, enough to create a clear gap. Through it, I could see the porch, the wooden boards, the railing, the dark shape of the yard beyond. And the chain, still latched, still taut. It connected the door to the frame in a straight line, as though both were closed. As though the space between them had simply shifted. I leaned closer. The gap between the door and the frame didn't behave like an opening. It didn't widen or narrow the way perspective should dictate. It stayed consistent, like a fixed slice of something removed and replaced with something else. I reached out. My fingers hovered inches from the chain. Don't touch it. The thought came unbidden, immediate and firm. Not fear exactly, more like instinct. The same kind of quiet warning that tells you not to step too close to the edge of a high place. I pulled my hand back. Instead, I leaned slightly to the side, trying to look through the gap without interacting with it. Outside, the porch looked normal. The light was on, casting its usual yellow glow. The railing cast familiar shadows across the boards. Beyond that, the yard stretched into darkness, the outline of the fence barely visible. Everything looked exactly as it should. Except, something moved. Not in the yard. Not on the porch. Inside. I froze. The movement had been subtle, just a flicker at the edge of my vision, somewhere behind me. I turned slowly, scanning the hallway. Nothing. The mirror caught my eye again. In its reflection, the hallway stretched longer than it should, the far end fading into a dimness that didn't exist in reality. And there, just at the edge of that reflected darkness, something shifted. A shape. Tall. Thin. Standing where the hallway should have ended. I turned fully, facing the actual hallway. It was empty. Completely, undeniably empty. The far wall was exactly where it had always been, the small framed picture hanging slightly crooked, the corner leading to the bedrooms just beyond. No movement. No figure. I looked back at the mirror. The hallway was normal again. Short. Finite. Ending exactly where it should. The shape was gone. I swallowed, my throat dry. Okay. I whispered, though the words sounded wrong in the quiet. Too loud. Too deliberate. I looked back at the door. Still open. Still latched. The cold air pressed in around me, and for the first time, I noticed something else. It wasn't just coming from outside. It was coming from behind me. I turned slowly. The hallway looked the same, but the temperature, it was dropping. Not gradually, but in pockets, patches of cold forming in the air, spreading like invisible stains. I took a step away from the door. The cold followed. Not all of it, not evenly, but enough that I felt it shift, as though the house itself were adjusting. I moved another step back. The door remained in my peripheral vision. Open, unchanged. And then, a sound. Soft. Faint. From outside. I turned my head toward the door. It was a voice. My voice. Hello. It came from the porch, just beyond the threshold. Clear, unmistakable. The exact tone I'd used earlier, when I'd called out absent-mindedly after locking up, checking that everything was secure. I hadn't thought about that moment until now. But there it was, repeating. Hello. I stared at the gap between the door and the frame. The voice came again, slightly closer. Hello. It wasn't echoing. It wasn't replaying. It was calling from outside. But I hadn't gone outside. I hadn't opened the door. I hadn't. Another sound interrupted the thought. From behind me. Footsteps. Light. Measured. Coming from deeper in the house. I turned slowly, my heart beginning to pound. The hallway stretched before me, dim and quiet. But the sound was unmistakable. Someone was walking. Inside. The footsteps were soft, almost careful, as though whoever, or whatever, was moving didn't want to be heard. They came from the direction of the bedrooms, approaching the hallway, approaching me. And then, they stopped. Silence crashed back in, heavier than before. I stood there, caught between the open door and the unseen presence behind me, my mind struggling to reconcile what I was experiencing. The voice came again from outside. Hello. But this time, it wasn't alone. Another voice overlapped it, also mine, slightly out of sync. Hello. Two identical calls, layered just enough to create a subtle distortion. Like hearing a recording played twice, slightly misaligned. I stepped back again, my shoulder brushing the wall. The cold intensified. And then I understood something. The door wasn't just open. It was connected. Not to the porch. Not entirely. I forced myself to look directly at the gap again. The porch was still there. The railing, the yard, the darkness beyond. But now, just at the edge of that darkness, I could see movement. Not in the yard. Closer. Just beyond the threshold. A figure stood there, facing inward. Its outline was wrong. Too still, too precisely shaped, like a cutout against the night. I couldn't make out features, but I didn't need to. I knew what it was. Or rather, what it was shaped like. Me. It lifted its head slightly. The porch light flickered, and in that flicker, I saw its face. My face. But empty. Not blank. Worse than blank. There were features, but they didn't hold meaning. Eyes that didn't focus, a mouth that curved without intention. It spoke. Hello. The voice came from inside the house. I spun around. The sound had come from behind me, from the hallway. But the figure was still outside. And the door hadn't moved. Still open. Still latched. The chain stretched between 2 points that no longer seemed to belong to the same space. I stumbled back, my breath quickening. The hallway felt longer now. Not in the mirror, in reality. The distance to the far wall seemed stretched, the corners deeper, the shadows thicker. Another step behind me. I turned. Something stood at the far end of the hall. Tall. Thin. exactly where I'd seen it in the mirror earlier. It didn't move. It didn't need to. I knew, with a certainty that settled like ice in my chest, that it was watching me. From inside. From the same place the voice had come. Another, hello, echoed, this time from both directions at once. Outside. Inside. Perfectly synchronized. I pressed myself against the wall, caught between them. The cold surrounded me now, no longer directional. It seeped from every surface, every angle, as though the house itself had lost its internal consistency. The figure at the end of the hall tilted its head. The figure outside mirrored the motion. Two identical gestures, separated by a boundary that no longer held. And then, the chain rattled. Just once. A soft metallic tremor. I looked at the door. It hadn't moved. But the space between it and the frame shifted. Not visibly. Not in a way I could track. But I felt it. A subtle realignment, like something clicking into place. The cold intensified, then steadied. The voices stopped. Silence returned. Heavy. Absolute. The figure outside was gone. The porch was empty. The hallway. I turned slowly. Empty. The far wall was back where it should be. The picture hung crooked, unchanged. No movement. No presence. I stood there, frozen, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Nothing did. After a long moment, I forced myself to move. One step toward the door. Then another. The cold receded slightly, though it didn't disappear. I approached the threshold carefully, my eyes fixed on the chain. It was still latched. Still taut. But the door was closed. Perfectly, normally closed. No gap. No distortion. Just the familiar surface of wood, flush with the frame. I stared at it, my mind struggling to catch up. Had it always been closed? No, it hadn't. I reached out, slowly this time, and touched the chain. It felt solid. Real. I unlatched it. The small metallic click sounded impossibly loud in the quiet. I hesitated. Then I opened the door. The porch lay beyond, exactly as it should. The night air was cool but normal, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and distant trees. No figures. No movement. Just stillness. I stepped outside. The boards creaked under my weight, familiar and grounding. I looked around, scanning the yard, the street beyond. Nothing. Everything was as it had always been. After a moment, I stepped back inside and closed the door. I locked it. I latched the chain. I stood there, staring at it, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. The house was quiet again. Normal. But as I turned to leave the entryway, something caught my eye. The mirror. It was straight now, aligned perfectly on the wall. But the reflection showed the door. Open. Wide open. And the chain. Still latched. In the reflection, the gap yawned like a wound in space, the porch visible beyond it. And standing just outside, facing in, was me. Watching. Not moving. Already inside. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. Because in that moment, with the reflection holding steady and the air growing cold once more, I understood the truth that had been forming all along. The door hadn't been opened to let something in. It had been opened to define the threshold. To mark the boundary. Between outside and inside. Between where I had been. And where I already was. Her voice echoed from the kitchen. She hadn't spoken. It came softly at first, like a memory brushing against the edge of awareness. A single word, too quiet to identify, folded into the stillness of the house and vanished before it could be understood. Mara stood in the hallway, one hand resting against the wall, listening. The house had been silent all evening. Not the comfortable quiet of an ordinary night, but a deeper, more deliberate absence of sound, the kind that seemed to press inward, flattening everything beneath it. The refrigerator's hum had faded hours ago. The faint ticking of the living room clock no longer reached her. Even the occasional distant car passing along the road had ceased. She had noticed it gradually, the way one notices the absence of wind only after realizing the trees have stopped moving. Now, in that silence, the sound from the kitchen lingered, not as a continued noise, but as a residue. A shape left behind in the air. She held her breath. Nothing followed. A long moment passed before she exhaled, slow and controlled, as though any sudden movement might disturb something delicate. It's just the pipes, she murmured, though the explanation felt thin even as she spoke it. Her voice didn't echo. The words fell flat, absorbed instantly by the walls. Mara frowned. She waited. Nothing repeated from the kitchen. She pushed herself away from the wall and took a step forward. The floorboard beneath her foot creaked, a familiar, grounded sound, and for a moment, that normalcy steadied her. Another step. The hallway stretched ahead, leading toward the kitchen at the back of the house. A faint glow spilled from that direction, the small nightlight she kept plugged in above the counter casting a weak, amber hue across the doorway. Everything looked as it should. But the air felt wrong. Cooler than it should have been, though not enough to see her breath. Just enough to make the skin along her arms tighten, as if reacting to something just below perception. She reached the threshold and stopped. The kitchen lay before her, quiet and still. The counters were clear, the sink empty. The refrigerator stood closed, its surface dull in the low light. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. Mara leaned slightly into the doorway, peering around the frame as though expecting something to reveal itself from a hidden angle. "Hello," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It vanished instantly. No echo. No delay. Just silence. She stepped inside. The tile floor felt colder than the hallway would. The temperature shift was subtle but noticeable, like crossing into a room that had been left unheated. Her gaze moved slowly across the space. The window above the sink reflected the interior of the kitchen, a faint duplicate layered over the darkness outside. The reflection looked normal at first, counter, cabinets, her own outline faintly visible. But as she watched, something about it felt out of alignment. Not visibly distorted, just slightly delayed. She moved her hand. In the reflection, it followed, but not immediately. A fraction of a second late, as though the image were catching up. Mara stilled. Her reflection stopped too, but the delay lingered, a subtle dragging motion that left her feeling unsteady. "That's not," she whispered. The word didn't echo, but something else did. From behind her. "That's not." Her voice. Same tone. Same volume. But it came from the hallway, not the kitchen. Mara spun around. The doorway stood empty, the hallway beyond dim and still. No one there. No movement. Her heart began to pound, each beat loud in her ears. "I didn't." She started. "I didn't." The voice repeated, this time from the kitchen. She froze. The sound came from her left, near the refrigerator. Same words. Same cadence. But she hadn't finished speaking. Her mouth was still open, the sentence incomplete. Slowly, carefully, she closed it. Silence. Then, a moment later. "Say anything." The rest of her sentence, completed in her voice, but spoken by something else. From behind her again. Mara's breath caught. The sound hadn't matched her timing. It hadn't followed her speech. It had anticipated it, or remembered it. She backed toward the center of the kitchen, turning slowly in place. "Okay," she said, louder now, testing the air. The word disappeared. A beat passed. Then, from the far corner near the sink. "Okay." Her voice. Softer this time. Not an exact match. There was a slight difference in the inflection, a subtle upward tilt at the end that made it sound almost questioning. Mara shook her head, her thoughts racing. "It's just acoustics," she said, though the explanation felt weaker now. "Acoustics," the kitchen repeated. But this time, the word stretched. The vowels lingered too long, the consonants softened, as though something were trying to shape the sound without fully understanding it. "Acoustics." The voice warped, then cut off abruptly. Mara's skin prickled. "That's not how echoes work," she whispered. The response came immediately. Not how echoes work. But it wasn't an echo. It overlapped her voice, beginning just as she spoke, ending just as she finished. Perfect synchronization, as though the sound had been produced at the same time. Not after. Not before. With her. She stopped speaking. The house fell silent again. But the silence no longer felt empty. It felt occupied, as though something was waiting within it, poised just beyond the edge of sound. Mara turned toward the window. Her reflection stared back. For a moment, it looked normal. Then it blinked. She hadn't blinked. Her eyes widened. The reflection's expression didn't change. It continued to stare, unblinking now, as though the earlier motion had been an independent act. Mara stepped back. The reflection followed, this time without delay. Perfectly aligned. Perfectly synchronized. Too perfect. She turned away from it, her chest tightening. Stop, she said, the word sharp, instinctive. Silence. Then, stop. The voice came from directly behind her. Closer than before. Too close. Mara spun. No one there. But the air felt different, as though something had just occupied that space and then withdrawn. Her thoughts spiraled. Am I saying these things without realizing it? Am I hearing something delayed? Is this? Another voice cut through her thoughts. Am I saying these things? It came from the hallway again. Then, overlapping it, without realizing it, from the kitchen, two fragments of her own internal question, spoken aloud, separated in space. Mara's breath hitched. She hadn't said that out loud. She was certain of it. The realization settled slowly, heavily. It wasn't just repeating her voice. It was accessing it. Not just the sounds she made, but the ones she didn't. The ones that hadn't formed yet. A faint sound broke the silence. A soft, rhythmic tapping. From the counter. Mara turned her head. The sound was subtle, almost imperceptible, like fingertips brushing lightly against a surface. Tap, pause, tap, pause. She stepped closer, drawn despite herself. The counter was empty. Nothing moved. But the sound continued, steady and deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't random. It had a pattern. 3 taps. Pause. 2 taps. Pause. 1 tap. Repeating. Like a signal. Mara leaned in, her ear close to the surface. The tapping stopped. Silence pressed in. Then, right beside her ear. Hello. She jerked back, a sharp gasp tearing from her throat. The word hadn't come from the room. It had come from inside the space where her hearing should have been. Too close to locate. Too precise to ignore. No, she said, shaking her head. No, 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 the kitchen replied. But now the voice carried something new. A tone. Not quite emotion, but an approximation of it. Curiosity. It sounded like it was trying to understand the word as it spoke it. No. The second repetition was closer. Clearer. More accurate. Mara stumbled backward, her heel catching on the edge of the rug near the doorway. She steadied herself against the wall, her pulse racing. I'm leaving, she said. The decision formed quickly, driven by instinct more than thought. She turned toward the hallway, toward the front of the house. Toward the door. I'm leaving. The voice repeated it instantly. But not from behind her. From ahead. From the living room. Mara froze. The words had come from the direction she intended to go. As though something had moved ahead of her, anticipating her path. I'm leaving, it said again. This time, the inflection was different. Confident. Certain. Not a repetition. A statement. Mara's mind reeled. It's trying to guide me. Or trap me. Or, the voice echoed softly from the kitchen. She squeezed her eyes shut, her thoughts spiraling faster. It knows what I'm thinking. It knows, came the reply. Her eyes snapped open. The house seemed to shift, subtly but unmistakably. The hallway looked longer than it should, the shadows deeper, the edges less defined. The silence pressed harder. Mara took a step forward. Then another. Each movement felt measured, deliberate, as though the space itself were resisting her. I just need to get out, she whispered. Get out, the voice agreed. But now it came from everywhere. The kitchen, the hallway, the living room, all at once, layered, overlapping. Her voice multiplied, each repetition slightly different, each carrying a subtle variation in tone, pitch, or timing. Get out, get out, get out. The words blurred together, forming a low, constant murmur that filled the house. Mara clamped her hands over her ears. It didn't help. The sound wasn't just external anymore. It resonated inside her head, vibrating through her thoughts. She staggered forward, moving through the hallway toward the front door. The air grew colder with each step. Her breath became visible now, faint clouds forming and dissipating in front of her. The murmuring voices softened as she moved, condensing into a single, clear tone. Her voice, speaking calmly. You're already here. Mara stopped. The words hung in the air, heavier than anything before. She turned slowly. The kitchen doorway loomed behind her, dark now, the faint amber light flickering weakly. You're already here, the voice repeated. But this time, it came from inside the kitchen. And it sounded correct. Perfectly aligned with her natural cadence, her natural tone. No distortion, no delay. Just her voice, as it should be. Already here, it said again. Mara felt something shift inside her chest. A quiet realization, forming at the edges of her understanding. The voice hadn't been trying to mimic her. It had been learning, refining, each repetition closer to the original. Each variation a step toward accuracy. And now, it had succeeded. The kitchen light flickered once more, then steadied. Mara found herself moving back toward it, drawn by something she couldn't name. The murmuring had stopped completely. The house was silent again. But the silence felt different now. Not empty. Not waiting. Resolved. She reached the doorway and looked inside. The kitchen stood exactly as it had before. Still. Quiet. Ordinary. Her reflection in the window stared back at her. Perfectly synchronized. Perfectly still. You're already here, it said. Her lips didn't move. But the voice matched her exactly. No difference. No delay. Mara stepped into the kitchen. The tile floor felt warm now. Normal. The air no longer pressed against her skin. Everything felt settled. Behind her, somewhere in the house, a faint echo lingered. Not of her voice. Of something else. A deeper tone, just beneath the threshold of hearing. It pulsed once, like a distant signal reaching its destination. Mara stood there, listening. Understanding came slowly, but completely. The voice hadn't been an echo. It hadn't been a repetition, or a glitch in the acoustics. It had been a call. A test. A way to map her voice, her thoughts, her presence within the space. To locate her. To define her. And now, it no longer needed to repeat. Because it already knew. Mara turned toward the window one last time. Her reflection smiled. Not out of sync. Not delayed. Just slightly, more certain. As though it understood something she didn't. Or perhaps something she had only just begun to. You're already here, it said again. And this time, when the words settled into the quiet of the house, they didn't feel like a warning. They felt like confirmation. Like a boundary marked. A threshold crossed long before she realized it existed. Outside, the night remained still and empty. Inside, the silence held steady. And somewhere within it, just beneath perception, something listened. Not for her voice. But for anyone else who might try to speak. Because the signal had already been sent. And it had already been received. Mara stood in the kitchen, her breathing slow, her thoughts quiet. There was nothing left to question. Nothing left to hear. Only the certainty that the house had been listening long before she arrived. And that now, it no longer needed to.